Amanda. I don't have anything interesting either.
Okay,
right,
let's we need a different
So
question.
give me your name, but then maybe tell me, like, if you're interested in, you know, national security, international affairs, or there's a particular region or issue you care about, give me a little bit of background. Or something you've done, a course that you've taken, maybe related to it that got your interest, something like that.
I'm Amanda, and I want to be president of the United States.
See?
I'm Riley, and like criminology and like that kind of stuff interests me. So
I'm Cassie, and I've been interested in forensics and network side, but I'm like to take that international.
I'm Dina, and I'm going to be an FBI agent. I also like medical stuff. I don't know how you can connect those two, but I'll figure it out. Yeah.
medical examiner.
I'm Nikki, and I really like just like all that like secretive stuff. I don't know, I think it's really fun.
I'm Kelly. I'm more interested in political economy.
I'm Shay, and I'm international relations.
I'm Britt, and I want to start my own international organization to help third world countries.
Great. Good. So, do you want me to just go tell a little bit about sort of?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah,
So I'll give a little bit of background on, you know, you guys obviously heard my spiel and some of the issues I focused on, but I'll give you a little bit of background on how I got to sort of, you know, the path that I took in government. Talk a little bit about, you know, the issues that as a woman in government, and then a woman in international affairs, and then a woman working in national security and on counterterrorism and special operations issues. It's a very different place and sort of a very niche place for me to be and in government in general. So I was interested in international affairs, political science issues when I was in high school, and decided when I went to college, I went to University of San Diego. I double majored in political science and media communications. And in the course of sort of my junior year, I started focusing more on the political science side of things, less on the media side. I wanted to originally be a broadcaster and be a broadcast political analyst. I said I'm going to be Wolf Blitzer, you know, or Bernard Shaw, or one of those. But I really became interested in the substance of international affairs and national security issues. I grew up as a Navy brat, so my dad was in the Navy. And I had a lot of exposure to those issues just from him. And so focused on political science. My junior year, 9/11 happened, going into my senior year. And so I was already focused on those issues, but that really laser-like focused me on what issues I cared about, the counterterrorism problem set, special operations issues. I was also very interested in weapons of mass destruction. So when you talk about public health and FBI and those kinds of issues, that's very much a weapon of mass destruction, biological or chemical. You're talking about a national security issues that has huge health ramifications. So I focused on those issues through my senior year of college. And for me, I went straight from undergrad to grad school. Many people take a break, many people go and work for a chunk of time. I was very motivated to continue to go into grad school and get my master's degree. Part of that was I knew I was interested in policy issues, sort of high policy strategy issues. And I learned from people in Washington that it's very difficult to be involved in those issues if you don't have a master's degree. And so for me, I went and got my master's degree at George Washington University in DC. I got it in international affairs, and I had a concentration in international security studies and security policy issues. So I really focused on international security issues. I wrote my thesis on how whether terrorists can be deterred from attacking, especially using weapons of mass destruction. And again, I was just kind of chomping at the bit to get out there and start doing the issues that I cared about. So I had heard about a program in grad school called the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. And it's a great program if you guys keep it in the back of your head and you are thinking about going into government. It is a way that the government really is able to recruit people, even in times where the government's tightening its belt and not hiring. The Presidential Management Fellowship Program is where folks in their second year of graduate school are brought into the government, work for the government for 2 years. You get to bounce around the government every 4 to 6 months to different jobs, try it out, see what you like, and then ultimately, when you complete the program, hire into a job in government. And you kind of hire into the fast track. They actually bring you in at a certain GS level, so pay scale, and you move up more quickly in those 2 years than you would generally because they're putting you in training and they're giving you sort of these opportunities and resources. So that's how I entered government, but I also considered the Foreign Service. So for anyone who's looking at the State Department, those are the people that work at the embassies overseas. And you take the Foreign Service exam. You can do that at any point. You don't need a graduate degree. But you take the Foreign Service exam, and if you get a certain score, you can become a Foreign Service officer, work at embassies overseas, and do things sort of from a diplomatic perspective. For me, the reason I didn't choose that path is I was chomping at the bit to get into national security. And to go the Foreign Service route, that could take 5 to 10 years before you could really focus on national security issues and kind of get your niche, and I wanted to do it right away. So I was fortunate enough to be picked up by the Pentagon and the Office of the Secretary of Defense for the Presidential Management Fellowship Program. So I went straight from grad school, went into the Pentagon, had a number of positions there that were focused on counterterrorism, special operations, policy, and development. I, in the course of this time, gotten my clearance, security clearance over time as well, which is also a must-have at a certain point if you're going to work on national security issues. But even if you're not national security and you're working on issues that are more focused on humanitarian issues, if you're working for State Department or USAID, there's generally a level of security. It may just be a secret clearance that you still have to sort of get in the course of that process. So for me, was in government, focused on in the Pentagon, worked on a lot of special operations, counterterrorism, in cyber issues as that started percolating up. Then was able to take an operational assignment, and this was one that was particularly interesting as a female to do, where I deployed the Special Operations Task Force in Iraq. So for 4 months, worked with special operators, not another female in sight in my office, because it was all, special operators, and at that time there were no women in combat roles as special operators. There were intel analysts that were women who were supporting the activities that special operators were doing. I was in the operational planning team, so I was kind of a strange bird for this group of guys who are generally used to conducting ops and doing planning and only doing that with other sort of operators and support. Suddenly I walk in, not military, civilian female, what do I know? Why am I in the midst of all these guys who are, knocking down doors and, finding terrorists and all of that? So it was interesting because, this is just as a female, something I found a few times in government, where one, I'll be the only female in the room amongst all men. That's changed a little bit over time. Maybe there's 2 or 3 now in the room. At the more senior levels of government, it's changed a lot more, and you actually see that. But that's at the most senior level. And then as you trickle down, you still have, a lot of males in those roles, particularly national security positions. And some of it's just because a lot of women haven't had an interest in doing those. Some of it is they're deterred from it because of the environment, or they're concerned that it will be particularly negative. So in my case, I'm with this operational unit. I have a huge barrier ahead of me because they're looking at me like, why are you here and you're useless, and sure, you're here, we'll deal with you. So my goal was to make myself absolutely indispensable, where they, when I left, they felt like they couldn't leave, couldn't not have someone like me in that position. And I reached that, and part of it was just communicating and letting them know, yes, I'm a civilian, yes, I'm a woman, yes, I'm someone who doesn't have this experience that you do, but you know what I do have? I know how Washington works. I know how you get things done. I know how you submit a policy to the White House and what you shouldn't be saying in your slides because they'll throw it out the door, and how you can couch something so you can show how you've considered what you're proposing and what the effects are, and you're sort of proposing a good idea, putting it on the table. So in that back and forth, by the time I left, they were saying, when's your replacement coming? How can we get someone in the door? So what I've encountered in government is sort of that, sometimes you're in that room and they dismiss you because you don't have necessarily the operational or the experience that, even as a man, I think they tend to think you would be more comfortable with, fighting or someone getting killed than as a woman you would be. And in the national security establishment, especially in a time of war, you're clearly dealing with those issues on a regular basis. But I found it to be sometimes to my advantage, because their expectations of me were so low. I just had to do a little, okay, and suddenly I was a genius, So I think you can kind of turn that around, use it to your advantage, walk into a room, be confident, know what you know, but also respect that there are experiences that you don't have that these people bring to the table and vice versa. So that's happened over time throughout my career because I was focused so much on special operations and counterterrorism issues, where I was more of a minority in the room. But those challenges, for me, they build character. You have to understand what that environment is like, and you have to be able to sort of navigate those issues very carefully. Be strong and speak up for yourself, but at the same time, recognize that that oftentimes when people have a perspective about sort of a woman in the room working on national security issues, it's just because they don't know any better. They haven't had the exposure to someone to know kind of how to interact and how to deal with them over time. As I moved on in my career at the White House, that was much less of an issue because you had incredibly talented people working at all levels of the White House. Even now, as some of you probably know, our national security advisor is a female. Her 2 deputy national security advisors are also female and grew up in the government. So things are shifting and changing over time. But it is still a challenge, and you'll certainly encounter it, I think, especially if you're entering what is still sort of a male-dominated environment in sort of the military sector and the national security sector. So with that, that's my piece, but I'd love to answer any of your guys' questions or just chat with you a bit more about your thoughts. Yes?
Did you feel you had to prove yourself in every position you were in because you're a woman?
So I felt like I had to prove myself because you have to prove yourself, right? You're new to a position, you want to sort of make an impact. There were a couple of positions that I felt that additional pressure. One was when I was deployed operationally, and I felt like that was just another factor. Plus you're deployed operationally with a bunch of guys, so their perspective is different than if you're in the Pentagon. I think what they think is acceptable sort of behavior. You're living and working with the same people all the time. And so, that there's sort of that element of things. But for the most part, again, my perspective was always, I'm proving myself because I need to do well and I want to do well. And then as your reputation comes before you, you're not really proving yourself. Then you're just living up to expectations because you want to sort of set the standard of how you're going to achieve. So by no means did I feel like that was constantly a barrier, but you do encounter people that have certain perspectives. Their perspective tends to be, some of those people will say, why are you working on special operations issues? You should be working on humanitarian issues. That seems like more perspective. And so those are just, challenges you have to work through. But I always took those as a challenge where I wanted to knock someone down a couple pegs and prove that I could do it. And so in the end, I had a really tremendous experience in government. And most of the time, I felt like there was so much credibility, that came with just how you delivered and how you performed. But there are times where you feel the gender difference, particularly when you're the only female in the room. And you see it with other women who sit in the back of the room. I would do it too. Not sit at the front of the table, be hesitant in sort of how you speak, or apologize. Say, I'm sorry, but here's what I was thinking. Why are you apologizing? Why are you caveating? Just say what you think. And I'm very guilty of that, for sure. But I think that can be an intimidating environment to express your voice.
Have you found that with other countries, and I know I've traveled to Asia multiple times, and
Mhm.
I've seen a lot of gender roles that there's no movement. Have you seen that in other countries too, where you go, or where you have gone? Have you seen other people in that culture who haven't been able to accept the fact that women are?
Yeah, definitely. I think it depends on the country. European countries less so. In fact, they oftentimes have a lot more women in those positions just over time and culturally. But certainly in some countries in Southwest Asia and the Middle East, I really am the only woman in a room of men talking about national security issues. And where you do see women, it's sort of in these limited roles. Again, I think that's an evolution over time, but yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's a challenge, and I take it as I think what's hard for me when you see that is they're treating me credibly. I'm sitting at the table, but they would never dream of necessarily treating this person credibly, who is obviously in their country and a fellow citizen, but they hold me in a little bit different esteem and a different mindset than they do women who I'm sure are equally capable in their own country. So, yes.
Do you travel a lot? Like, how often do you go?
Some. So if I were someone who focused, I focused more functionally, so counterterrorism, cyber issues. So the places I would travel weren't always the best on counterterrorism issues, because if you have a counterterrorism problem, frequently it's a place that is maybe not the safest. But within government, you can sort of choose those positions that you want to be in. So that have more travel to them. So if you're someone who focuses on a specific region, you'll probably travel a good amount to that particular region. I mean, just in my 12, 13 years in government, I traveled to Europe any number of times, to Germany probably 5 or 6 times, to Prague, to the UK, to London probably 5 or 6 times. But then also overseas, certainly. I traveled to Kenya for my job for counterterrorism issues. I was supposed to travel to Nigeria, that got changed last minute. I was supposed to travel to Yemen, that also got changed last minute because of the security issues. I lived in Iraq for 4 months on my deployment. So there were definitely opportunities to travel, and I think you have those more based on the job that you choose. As a Foreign Service officer, you would certainly have those a lot. But even if you're not in the Foreign Service, as a civilian in the Defense Department, people traveled a lot because there were overseas conferences, it's international affairs. That's the beauty of that, is at some point you're likely to have a TDY overseas, or overseas travel.
When you do go to other places, what's the least experiences you've had? What's the most thing? It's hard to explain. What's the most you do when you go there, and what's the least? So you said conferences, more smaller things, or those extreme type things.
So yes, so conferences, right? You sit there, you go. One time I went to a conference. This was in Colombia, where I was the U.S. representative to a UN conference on counterterrorism. And so, as the U.S. representative, I had to make a speech about our counterterrorism strategy and plans and policy. So that was pretty exciting. Having the UN name tag in front of you was, an exciting thing. That also made me a target because I was in the United States at a UN conference, and so there were a lot of perspectives to be had. But it was tremendous because you're sort of in the trenches and talking about those things. Another high experience for sure was when I was in Kenya, and we were doing counterterrorism training for the Kenyans. So we were offering sort of lessons learned that the United States had from encounters with counteractive shooter scenarios and that kind of thing, or multiple bombs and locations. And so we were training Kenyans on some of those lessons learned and helping them walk through their own capabilities and figure out what gaps might exist and where they should boost their capabilities. And we were in a particular location in Kenya that, as we walked through this exercise, and then 4 or 5 months later, they had that exact kind of thing happen. And so it was the same services, the same people we were training, the same people we were in the room with, who were suddenly faced with that real time in the real world. And so it was rewarding to be able to do that. At the same time, you recognize, I can pop in and train you and, have this week-long experience, but these are the folks who are dealing with that day in and day out, and very much had to address the challenges that we were trying to train them for.
All right, well, thank you. Our time is up here, but I just want to thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Sina, for sharing your wisdom with the students here, and thanks to all of you for being brave and for asking good questions. And so thank you so much.
Great.